Hello everyone, Ace here, and today we'll be discussing the whole violent video games debate that's recently resurfaced. Or more specifically, my opinion on how exactly it's managed to resurface into the political discourse. Because while it was once considered a major political debate, since at least the late 2000s to early 2010s, no one really talked about this issue. And so a casual observer could be completely forgiven for thinking that this particular matter had been once and truly resolved, and therefore completely surprised once it returned again. However, I'm here to tell you that that is not actually what happened, and instead I'm going to be making the argument, as you could probably tell by the title, that the social justice community acted as a sort of life support which ultimately revived the violent video game debate. And while this may be an unintended consequence of their actions, the simple truth is that it is still impacting the industry. But how, you may ask, did social justice warriors and the modern game journalists end up causing this situation? To which I say they've created this mess by linking video games to violent ideologies, or to at the very least suggest that these violent video games desensitize people to these particular ideologies, making them more susceptible to their vile rhetoric. The most obvious example in recent memory has got to be the extra credits video, which tried to suggest that violent video games set during World War II turned people into Nazis, who I must add were the followers of a particularly violent ideology. So to suggest that playing these particular video games can turn people down that particularly dark path, you are arguing by extension that these video games in turn promote violence, if indirectly that is. And it's important to note that while extra credits is the most recent and obvious example, it's far from the only example. In fact, it's not even the only example that I've covered this year that's made that claim. Let's talk about Jim Sterling, or more specifically the Jimquisition that he made on March the 18th regarding The Division 2, and the developers trying to defend the game by saying that it's apolitical. Now, while it is true that the vast majority of his video is discussing the political influence that these developers inadvertently slip into their game, and not necessarily discussing the political opinions of the end users themselves who actually buy and play the games. However, at the timestamp of 13 minutes and 17 seconds, Jim has this to say.
In a way, it's not hard to see why game companies could be scared to be seen having opinions. We live in some fucked up times where battle lines are being drawn in the sand over comic book movies, and where political radicalization is one of social media's biggest problems. We're dealing with real-life Nazis again. There's a very real terror out there about becoming targeted in the next big shitstorm, and I can appreciate that.
As you could tell, Jim here is making the attempt to be sympathetic to the game developers and publishers, and his attempt is built around the explanation that if they decided to make their game political and take a political stance specifically, that it would draw very severe ire for them, which could hurt both their reputation and their sales. But it's interesting to note that he's making the insinuation that, quote, real-life Nazis have this sort of power to do so over social media, and desire to do so to a video game developer and publisher specifically, which invariably leads to questions like why would Nazis be interested in video game development unless Jim Sterling here were to believe that they represent a disproportionately large part of the video game community, which in turn invariably leads to the question of why does Jim Sterling seem to believe that Nazis represent a large part of the video game community? And that latter question is ultimately answered by the narrative that the social justice community itself has pushed for many years now, through books, through news articles, and yes, now through YouTube videos made by their supporters, all of which seem to suggest that video games actively push people to the far right due to far-right politics inadvertently put within them, or at the very least desensitize people to far-right ideology, making it more palatable. Now, some people might go so far as to say that I'm looking far too much into what Jim Sterling is actually saying here, to which I must counter that particular claim by pointing out that this is the exact sort of narrative and political philosophy that Jim Sterling was promoting throughout his entire video, so it's perfectly acceptable to hold him to the standards that he wishes to hold others. Therefore, it's nothing short of hypocritical of him to actually complain about the actions of the president or of Walmart when they're taking the exact sort of actions that are the natural, inevitable conclusion of his particular arguments, that violent video games promote violent ideologies, which in turn promote violence. All they're doing is taking out the middleman, to which it simply says violent video games promote violence. Now, of course, I personally fundamentally disagree with both the president and Walmart in their claims that violent video games promote violence. But I also fundamentally disagree with the social justice narrative, the narrative pushed by people such as Jim Sterling, that violent video games promote violent ideologies, which in turn promote violence. But believe it or not, suggesting that the video game community is a safe haven for Nazis is not the only means by which social justice warriors and game journalists have politically re-legitimized the argument that violent video games cause violence. In fact, allow me to demonstrate how one of their favorite phrases, specifically Gamergate was a harassment campaign, is itself in support of the political argument that violent video games promote violence. At least when you view it through the lens of social justice, that is. Because for one, the social justice community has decided to call online harassment, quote, online violence, as demonstrated very cleanly from this article from amnesty.org. So in other words, when members of the social justice community make the claim that Gamergate was a harassment campaign, they are making the claim that in their perspective, Gamergate was committing acts of violence. Which brings me to the social justice narrative of the motive that they believe Gamergaters had for committing these so-called acts of violence, which is that these Gamergaters were attempting to do all of this to protect their video game community and the politically incorrect video game franchises within it from the social justice movement. But it's very important to note that violent video games were very heavily overrepresented in all of these games that the social justice warriors claimed to be politically incorrect. So in other words, when translating the social justice narrative of Gamergate was a harassment campaign to the layperson, it could perhaps most accurately be described as the social justice warriors believing that gamers, in their fanatical admiration for certain franchises, defended them by committing acts of violence against the social justice community. So in other words, when analyzed through the perspective of the social justice lens, it's quite clear that the phrase Gamergate was a harassment campaign is itself making the argument that violent video games promote violence, in its own little way at least. And to suggest that this is the line of thinking that social justice has taken on this matter is only strengthened with all of these articles and arguments that violent video games, as well as video games in general, have promoted far-right ideologies, or at the very least desensitized gamers to them, which ultimately results in these people converting to those said violent ideologies. But of course, I should mention very specifically that this is again what the social justice narrative supports. I myself completely disagree with the statement that Gamergate was a harassment campaign, and I've debunked that particular line of thinking repeatedly. Just like how I disagree with the idea that violent video games cause violence, or that video games that include certain ideologies promote those ideologies, or at the very least desensitize people to them. But I do believe that a video talking about this subject is very important nevertheless, because at the end of the day, I believe that it will only cause harm to the industry if the only people talking about these subjects are the ones that actively believe in them. And it's especially bad when the attacks on games and the video game community comes from both the left and the right. I have every expectation that this will probably be one of the more controversial videos I make on this channel, but I am of course completely open to discussion over this matter, and I will of course be providing links in the description below as well. In any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.